What if Luffy was raised by Mihawk, the greatest swordsman in the world? How would that change his journey through the seas of One Piece? The scenario begins with the canon sequence intact, where Shanks visits Fuchsia Village, saves Luffy from the Sea King, loses his arm, and spends a year with the crew. When he departs, instead of leaving Luffy behind for Garp's arrangement with Dadan, the mountain bandit, he takes Luffy to Kuraigana Island in Paradise and places him under Mihawk's supervision, because Mihawk is where extraordinary things are shaped into something the world cannot ignore. Garp tracks Shanks down furiously to demand the boy back, but receives an argument he cannot counter on its merits and cannot force the issue without starting a war. So he does the very Garp thing of involving himself directly instead, visiting the island twice a year and running Luffy through brutal physical conditioning while tolerating Mihawk's company, because Mihawk is the only person on the island who does not pretend to find his jokes funny. What also changes as a result of this is the brotherhood that never forms. Ace and Sabo are under Dadan in the forests around Mount Kolubo, and the third person who would have completed their triangle is simply absent. Ace never has a little brother who genuinely does not care about Roger's bloodline and loves him without qualification, and Sabo recovers his memories at Dressrosa and remembers only one brother rather than two. Both of them function, and both of them are capable of extraordinary things, but they just carry more unresolved weight into the sea than they do in canon. Now here's where the fruit situation gets complicated. The Gum Gum fruit is not actually the Gum Gum fruit, because it is the Hito Hito no Mi model Nika, the mythical Zoan the world government has been chasing for 800 years, and canon has established firmly that this fruit has its own will and steers itself toward its chosen bearer. Shanks knew this when he stole it from the government ship, which is exactly why he never ate it himself despite having it in his possession for years. In this scenario, he does not give Luffy the fruit or the straw hat when he first deposits him at Kuraigana at age 7, and instead waits until Luffy is approximately 10, returns to examine what 3 years of Mihawk's instructions has produced, and makes the handoff deliberately the moment he recognizes the boy is still entirely and unmistakably himself underneath every new discipline. The fruit, the hat, and the promise all transfer at the same moment, made privately between two people with no witnesses and no warm community to remember it. Just a child on a gloomy island receiving a challenge with the world's greatest swordsman watching from the castle window without comment. Eating the Nika fruit at 10 with 3 years of instruction already inside him produces a different first relationship with rubber properties that canonical Luffy's experience doesn't have, where canonical Luffy discovers every application of his rubber body through pure creative desperation in situations where improvisation is the only tool available. This Luffy approaches the sudden stretching and bouncing body as new variables to integrate within a framework he has already started building. Mihawk adapts his instruction without ceremony, treating a sudden rubber student as a problem that has become more specific, which is exactly the kind of problem he finds satisfying. Kuraigana Island is dark, gloomy, and populated by human drills, which are enormous baboon-like creatures who absorbed human combat techniques by watching the wars that devastated the island's former kingdom. They are not training partners from day one, and for the first 2 years, Mihawk keeps Luffy within the castle grounds through the implicit authority of his presence. When Luffy's Conqueror's Haki manifests around the age of 9 with an outburst that knocks out every human drill on the island simultaneously and cracks a section of the castle wall, the largest ones start approaching with the wariness the creatures that have learned to assess threats by watching them carefully. By 10, when the Nika fruit activates and every attack the human drills land bounces harmlessly back at them, they transition into genuinely useful sparring partners, because nothing teaches you how to use a rubber body defensively like fighting creatures whose strikes return to them at full force. Mihawk's instruction produces something specific and visible in how Luffy fights. His footwork is precise in a way canonical Luffy's footwork never is, because he manages to distance with intention rather than charging headlong into whatever is in front of him. His armament Haki activates deliberately rather than instinctively, coating the parts of his body he has chosen to coat rather than spreading wherever the pressure of the moment sends it. When he throws a punch, it comes from a planted stance rather than from the end of a stretched arm fired from 20 feet away. So where canonical Luffy hits like a rubber hurricane, this Luffy hits like someone who learned what hitting was supposed to mean before he had a rubber body to do it with. The rubber body adds to the foundation, whereas in canon, the rubber body was the foundation. Gear Second develops during the training years through sustained observation of Mihawk's movement at extraordinary speed, but the specific crystallizing insight only arrives at Eni's lobby when Luffy finally encounters actual Soru in motion, and watching Blueno move in a way his training has been circling for years without fully articulating snaps something to focus so that the development feels like recognition rather than revelation. Gear Third he discovers through pure experimentation during training, since figuring out what happens when you put enough air into rubber bones is exactly the kind of unsanctioned experiment Luffy conducts regardless of how structured his environment is. Mihawk finds evidence of this one morning and says nothing about it, getting Getting from the Grand Line to the East Blue is not possible through Reverse Mountain, which only functions as a one-way entry point where currents flow upward from the Blues into the Grand Line. So the only route back runs through the Calm Belt, the nesting ground for the world's largest sea kings. Mihawk provides a small self-propelled vessel with sea stone lining at the hull, which suppresses the Sea King's ability to detect the ship. But there is a cost, since sea stone emits the same aura as the sea and weakens Devil Fruit users through sustained contact. Luffy arrives in the East Blue drained and needing recovery time, which is a fitting first test. He starts from the East Blue rather than the Grand Line because starting in Paradise immediately means encountering threats scaled for Paradise before he has assembled a crew, or tested his judgment in an environment Mihawk did not create. Luffy would frame this as wanting to see everything, and he would be framing it incorrectly, but he would not be entirely wrong either. At Shellstown, Zoro recognizes Mihawk's instruction, living in Luffy's footwork and movement patterns immediately. The fingerprints unmistakable to someone who has spent his career measuring himself against their source. He joins because Luffy's capability earns his respect, and because the connection between his captain's training and his own ultimate goal makes this the only possible crew for someone with his particular ambition. Their dynamic throughout the story is more competitive than canonical Luffy and Zoro's relationship, with Zoro using his captain as a living diagnostic reading of his own distance from his goal, which sharpens both of them continuously. At Orange Town, Buggy's Barabara no Mi meets a rubber body that cannot be cut, so the nose grab works and the fight is more deliberate in style. But the fundamental matchup is unchanged. Don Craig's attack on the Barati is defeated through armament haki, penetrating his armor and observation haki awareness, keeping Luffy ahead of the poison gas. And while the fight demands more tactical precision than canonical Luffy's version, it produces the same result. The Barati itself is the scenario's most dramatically loaded early moment. Mihawk arrives pursuing Craig's fleet and finds Luffy there, examines the small crew, asks a direct single question about whether Luffy understands what he is attempting, and receives an answer that is pure Luffy, which is completely certain, entirely unreasonable, and utterly sincere. He acknowledges it without changing expression, then defeats Zoro as in canon, and tells him about the rival worthy of his ambitions with complete awareness of who Zoro's captain is before departing. The only person who reads the full meaning of the exchange is Sanji, who watches someone receive acknowledgement from the world's greatest swordsman and understands that this specific captain is not an ordinary problem. Crocodile at Alabasta is defeated through armament haki rather than through blood moisture, exploiting a Sand Logia's weakness, since haki allows physical strikes to reach Logia users directly, and Luffy's armament development is significantly more advanced than canonical Luffy at this point. The fight still nearly kills him multiple times though, because Crocodile is dangerous, independent of his elemental properties, and the specific creativity required to figure out Crocodile's vulnerability in a fight where the environment keeps killing you is something haki development does not replace. Enel at Skypiea presents no specific matchup problem, because the rubber body's immunity to lightning is unchanged, and more developed armament haki means Enel encounters someone immune to his offensive output and capable of landing coded strikes against his Logia defense simultaneously. The fight is shorter as a result, since Enel's specific combination of god complex and genuine power meets a matchup for whom both his offense and his defense are compromised at once, and he has no framework for handling someone who should not be able to hurt him, but certainly can. At Eni's lobby, Gear 2nd surfaces for the first time during the confrontation with Bueno, with the crystallizing recognition completing years of circling understanding. Gear 3rd then carries more of the Lucci fight than in canon, since Gear 2nd is newly active rather than already developed. And while the win is costly, in a way that establishes the ceiling above Eni's lobby is higher than Luffy has reached, he wins because the story requires it, and because his developed haki and rubber properties create a combination Lucci's Rokushiki cannot definitively answer. In the whole Cake Island arc, Luffy enters Big Mom's territory to retrieve Sanji, and the confrontation with Katakuri in the mirror world is where Mihawk's training becomes most visibly relevant. Katakuri's mastery of advanced observation haki, specifically future sight that allows him to see attacks before they happen and respond before they land, is the defining obstacle of the fight. And in canon, Luffy develops a rudimentary future sight during the fight itself through the specific pressure of being beaten repeatedly by someone who already has it. In this scenario though, Luffy enters the mirror world with meaningfully more developed observation haki from years of training with Mihawk, who moves at speeds that require observation to track effectively. He does not have future sight walking in, but the gap between where he starts and where he needs to be is smaller, which changes the fight's rhythm so that he reaches the insight faster and under less catastrophic accumulated damage, meaning he leaves the fight less destroyed, and the emotional cost of the arc, though unchanged in substance, is slightly less physically devastating for him specifically. Ace is sentenced to execution, and Luffy learns of it as news about a notable pirate, a stranger who refused to name his captain before the world government. He goes to save him on principle rather than on love, because Ace is not his sworn brother and they have never met, but someone who refuses to name his captain under government pressure is the most Luffy-resonant thing a stranger can do, and principle at Luffy's extremity is not obviously lesser than love. It produces a more controlled performance with less screaming and more sustained combat intelligence. A fighter who is not collapsing under the weight of a specific grief, but is instead fighting with the specific fury of someone who thinks this execution is wrong and is willing to die rather than accept it. Here is the scenario's most significant traumatic fact, and it cannot be treated lightly. Mihawk is present at Marineford on the Marine side. He is a warlord, and he fights as a warlord, which means somewhere on the battlefield is the person he raised for a decade. In canon, Mihawk specifically targets Luffy to test how far he has come, and Vista of the Whitebeard Pirates intervenes, and in this scenario, when their positions on the battlefield converge, Mihawk engages Luffy as a combatant on the opposing side. He does not spare him out of sentimentality, and he does not avoid him out of guilt, because neither of those is something Mihawk does. And the exchange is a test in the same way the canonical one is, with Mihawk assessing what the training produced under the specific pressure of someone genuinely trying to kill the person in front of them. Vista intervenes again, and the outcome is Luffy surviving it, shaken by the specific quality of what it means to be tested, rather than spared by the person who raised you. The battlefield moves on, and neither of them has a framework for discussing what just happened, so neither of them does. Garp, meanwhile, watches his grandson fight through the greatest naval fleet in the world from the same position he always watches from, not interfering and never sure whether this makes him proud or horrified, the ambiguity having been constant since the day Shanks took Luffy to Kuraigana Island. Ace still dies. The moment is too fast for principle to override biology, and Luffy's grief is real but manifests differently from canonical devastation without being lesser. The 2-year decision and the message to the crew all proceed because they are driven by Luffy's character rather than by the specific shape of his grief. Zoro is sent by Kuma to Kuraigana Island during the Sabaody scattering and spends 2 years training under Mihawk. And the specific irony writes itself, since Zoro is training under the man who raised his captain in the place where that raising happened, and learning through methodologies that shape the person Zoro is trying to surpass in order to surpass someone else entirely. What Mihawk does not say about Luffy during those 2 years, Zoro learns by reading the spaces between the instruction. And 2 years on the island where Luffy spent a decade is its own kind of education about what Mihawk actually built. Luffy, on the other hand, trains with Rayleigh at Rusukaina Island in the Calm Belt for the full 2 years, where Gear 4th develops through Rayleigh's armament hockey integration instruction combined with Rusukaina's demands. From a higher starting baseline, the 2 years produce mastery rather than discovery. The New World arcs proceed with a crew whose absolute levels are higher than canonical equivalents at each equivalent point. So Doflamingo falls to Gear 4th at Dressrosa, and Kaido falls to Gear 5 at Wano. Gear 5 activates because the Nika Fruit's awakening is a property of the fruit's will rather than the user's approach to their own power, and the joy is intrinsic to Nika's nature and cannot be trained away. What arrives in someone who has been consciously analyzing their rubber body for years is informed delight rather than pure innocent abandon, which is a different flavor of the same power. Then the 7 warlord system is abolished at the Reverie. The Marine fleet surrounds Kuraigana Island, and Mihawk grows annoyed enough by their persistence to accept Crocodile's offer to co-found the Cross Guild, abandoning Kuraigana Island permanently and relocating. This happens during Wano's events rather than after them, which means while Luffy is fighting to liberate one country from a Yonko's grip, Mihawk is being driven out of the island that was Luffy's entire childhood by the institution Luffy is simultaneously dismantling. To say this plainly, Mihawk is abandoning the place where he raised Luffy because the Marines are besieging it, and Luffy is one of the primary forces destroying the world government that sent those Marines. The Cross Guild places bounties on Marines in direct inversion of the world government's power structure, and through completely different paths that both began on the same dark island, Mihawk and Luffy arrive at the same structural opposition. They do not coordinate toward this, and they do not discuss it, and neither of them is particularly good at that kind of conversation. But the irony exists whether it gets spoken or not. At Elbaf, Luffy finally meets Shanks again, and this is not the idol glimpsed as a child and built into a dream figure across years of distance. This is the man who gave Luffy to Mihawk, who returned 3 years later with the fruit and the hat and a promise made in private with no witnesses, and who has been watching from a distance across every impossible thing that followed. Their meeting is between two people who have complex feelings about their specific arrangement that neither of them has organized into clear language. Luffy does not hold grievances in the canonical form, but he is not operating in ignorance either. He knows what that island cost him in terms of the brothers he never had and the childhood that looked nothing like anyone else's, and he knows what it gave him, but he has not yet decided how those two things balance against each other, and he's not sure he needs to decide. The Straw Hat goes back here, fulfilling the private promise made on a gloomy island that Shanks chose with without asking. Luffy kept it through a decade of darkness, a calm belt crossing, every ridiculous impossible thing the Grand Line produced. Marineford, the time skip, and 2 Yonkos, all the way through the world government's collapse. When it changes hands again, both of them know what it cost, and neither of them says so, because that is who both of them are. Subscribe and smash the like button for more One Piece videos.